Well, welcome back from break. And the second half of the training is design, which again is a shortened version of basic training. Um, so moving right along, as I mentioned earlier, this one is a lot of pictures, so it will hopefully flow a bit easier. So we'll briefly cover design in Main Street, how design fits within the Main Street approach, the roles of the design committee, and then actually differently from all the other trainings, we're going to spend some time talking about the design and preservation philosophy that committee members and board members should be aware of, rather than necessarily specific work of the committees. Only because there's a lot of background information that people need to be aware of when it comes to design. So we'll spend time talking about character defining elements, not so much time on public improvements and streetscape, but we'll touch on it, commercial building anatomy, basic building maintenance, and then we'll finish with financial incentives. So we'll save the most important for last, right? To make sure you stay. All right, well, diving right into design in Main Street, and we'll show this slide again. Design is one of the 4 points, but it's just like organization, it's also the most important point. It is unique in that it's the only one that deals with the physical fabric of a community. So the other points basically deal with people, and design's realm is anything and everything that's within the Main Street district that a person can interact with. So then there's an unofficial 5th point that we'll add, which is sustainability. It tends to be a buzzword rather than a fully acknowledged sort of approach, but it is an important aspect that ties into historic preservation. So in terms of the Main Street approach, sustainability and design are kind of combined. They're inherent, and we'll explain a little bit why. But I think it's important to point out that it's included. So Main Street is a preservation-based economic development program, and preservation-based is a key descriptor here to distinguish Main Street from another economic development program. So in essence, without the historic commercial core and without that preservation-based approach, this management system could be replicated in other places and in other ways. So it's this historic commercial core, that historic fabric and historic preservation that make Main Street Main Street. And that's why design is the most important point. Design is integral to the Main Street approach, and not just because it makes things look better or prettier, like these 2 photos illustrate, but it also is about other improvements within the downtown, including infrastructure, things that people interact with, and things that make people's lives easier, and experiences of downtown easier, but that may not necessarily be acknowledged. It is also about instituting and enforcing policies that allow these kinds of improvements to happen. All of that is included within the realm of the design point within Main Street. So I offer this photograph as a way to separate the past from where we want Main Street to go. It's not about returning Main Street of today to this point, but it is about Main Streets and our downtowns once again becoming mixed-use centers of commercial, residential, industrial activities. The golden age or glory days of Main Street, as seen in this photograph, are not coming back, but this commercial, residential, industrial, civic center of the community is still Main Street. It can still be that, and that's what the Main Street program is about. It's about bringing those activities back to downtown. The Main Street effort was begun to deal with the blight of downtowns, and which occurred after economic activity was leaving the historic commercial cores, beginning in the 1950s and 60s, as highways and subsequently strip and mall developments took away commercial and retail activity from downtown. And as activity left, buildings were neglected and deferred maintenance occurred, and this is a site that's not uncommon in a lot of Main Street or a lot of communities, whether they're Main Street or not. But the Main Street district, our downtowns, still possess the history, heritage, and architecture that's unequaled to other parts of the community. So all of these components, the fabric that exists, is not just about the appearance, but it is a testament to the history of the community and every single change that a building has underwent. And as we'll see in a little while, it's not uncommon to have storefronts that are not original to a particular building, but they're still historic. All of those changes are essentially physical manifestations of the economic aspirations and development of the community, or at least of its downtown, throughout the last 150 years or so. Now, this look of Main Street is such a bankable atmosphere, such a great aesthetic, that developers of new commercial architecture and retail development have capitalized on this and recognized this, I should say, and they make new strips to look like, imitation Main Streets. But what these obviously lack is that character and original fabric of your communities. These are just fake imitations of well, they're real imitations, but they're fake Main Streets. Now, the best example of that probably in the country is Main Street USA, which is actually a very clever or cleverly executed and scaled version of a real Main Street of Walt Disney's summer vacation destination in Missouri. And of course, having Mickey Mouse and the gang on your side helps to attract millions of visitors each year. All of that helps, but it's still capitalizing on the appearance of a historic commercial architecture, the real thing that exists in your communities. Design is also a promotional tool. So as physical improvements in the downtown occur, and the downtown is obviously a backdrop for economic and tourism activity, people become aware of these improvements, and their opinions about downtown tend to change too. So design as a signifier of economic change is very important. And design is not a substitute for a well-run business, by no means, a business that sells products and provides services that people want, but improving a business, physical improvements, modernizations, whatever the phrase may be, certainly do help. And if you as a customer have a choice between patronizing two shops that offer exactly the same services, you're going to go to the one that is that's more attractive to you in appearance, because that signifies prosperity, cleanliness, a certain design aesthetic, whatever it is. It's this intrinsic quality that people look for when they shop. So quickly about design committee, and we'll revisit this flow chart again. It is one of the committees, and again, its work can be subdivided into various projects such as public improvements or design education. But the role of the design committee is unique because it is historic preservation based, and it deals with real physical fabric that exists, that comprises your downtowns. The design committee often interfaces with existing organizations such as the Historical Society or the Historic Preservation Commission, planning and zoning boards, county and regional planning agencies, and the State Historic Preservation Office. In terms of the Historical Society or the Preservation Commission, a certain overlap between the organizations is encouraged. So it's always a good idea to have a couple of the design committee members be involved with these other groups. That facilitates that communication that we talked about during the organizational component of the training. And just like any other committee, it's important for these members of the design committee to speak with one voice. So present a unified approach to the community at large. The four things that the design committee does, again, generally speaking, we don't have time to get into each of these in more detail today, but one is educating others about good design, and that can be done through promoting trainings, through meeting with owners, and showing them before and after examples from other communities, or developing a library of good recommendations and technical information regarding building rehabilitation. The other is providing good design advice, and that again could be through the committee itself. If you have an architect that's well versed in historic preservation on the committee, that's great. Or you can, subsidize that effort, or utilize the State Historic Preservation Office to provide some of that through some trainings. The design committee also plans Main Street development, so that means instituting certain policies, or making sure that the regulations and ordinances that are in place allow for development to happen and for rehabilitation to happen. That means looking at historic preservation ordinance, sign ordinances, any other regulations that have an impact on the downtown's built environment, to make sure that they're friendly towards rehabilitation. And motivating others to make changes can occur either through developing financial incentives like facade and awning improvement grants, or through actually taking on projects as a committee, hands-on projects, however small they may be, like a storefront repainting project, for example, or a display window improvement, and motivating others by showing a real example in the community that it can be done, and again, motivating others to do the same. Let's talk about character-defining elements. Those are elements that essentially distinguish your downtown from any other downtown. They are what makes your community is what it is. And so this slide, it always gets a good response. How could it not? The point here being is that difference is encouraged, and difference is antithetical to Main Street's development. As in the competitive retail environment of Main Street, even though there is a certain hierarchy between building materials and lots and sizes and heights and setbacks and all those things, each establishment, each building always tried to distinguish itself from its neighbors, and for purely economic reasons. But that is the nature of Main Street, and to impose some sort of theme uh, would be opposite to what Main Street is all about. So it's about recognizing the ethic, the preservation ethic, preserving things not just as they are, but recognizing those character defining elements versus sacrificing your town's identity for a unified whole, which it never was. Yes, there's a certain cohesiveness that exists between the buildings, but there's a still certain level of individuality that is not only allowable but should be encouraged. This is another way to demonstrate that it's not so much about making everything look prettier, but figuring out when to leave something that needs to be left alone. So, and this speaks for itself. We know the Mona Lisa, and could she receive this treatment? Yes, but it wouldn't be her anymore. So we understand that here. So why is it that we have a hard time recognizing that on Main Street? Well, one of the things that has occurred is through this competitive retail environment since Main Street's beginnings, the ground floor level of commercial buildings was often remodeled, and that on a typical cycle of 20 years or so. And so we typically have storefronts that are not original to the construction date of the building, but the upper facade is. Well, that's okay. That's part of Main Street's development, and in this case, this structural glass storefront from the 1930s is just as historic as the 1878, I think it is, rest of the building. And as time goes on, actually the importance of the storefront becomes relatively higher as people have been longer exposed to this change rather than to the original storefront that is no longer there. So as you consider possible developments and improvements on Main Street, would you sacrifice real historic fabric that talks about Mr. Jackson, improving his storefront during the Depression, maybe participated in the New Deal program? It was obviously an effort to spur a retail activity and remain competitive. Would you sacrifice that entire story for a 2012 version of a new storefront, our version of what we think may have existed there in 1878? Those are the kind of choices that you have to make. Well, I'll make them for you. The answer is no, you don't do that. You keep this storefront, and because it's historic, and you work with it. And so what that it doesn't match the rest of the building? The matching component is not important. It's something that we just have to get over. But these character-defining elements, as we tend to refer to them in the preservation world, can be anything in the community. A county courthouse like this beautiful one in Pittsfield is an obvious landmark, right? I mean, if you had something like this in your town, you would identify with it. It's beautiful. It occupies a prominent spot in the community. And in fact, Pittsfield's organizations, both governmental and civic and nonprofits, all identified with the courthouse and utilized the dome as their graphic element. It's a obvious recognition of an important element in the community. They can be a little bit more, unusual, like this roadside icon in Collinsville, the world's largest ketchup bottle. It is historic. It's old enough. So anything that's 50 years or older can be considered historic. I apologize for those 50 years or older in the attendance. But you may be eligible for listing on the National Register. There you go. But these character-defining elements don't even have to be building or structures. They can be painted ghost signs like this one, advertising a a product that's no longer available in this case. Um, so when these exist, even though this paint is fading, again, by removing it or repainting or painting over it, you're removing a layer of history. You're not just an advertisement that informs us of a product that was available, but in terms of graphic design too. So there are a number of elements here that are historically that have historic significance. Signs could be also neon signs. So, and yes, neon can be historic, and in fact, it's made a resurgence now, both for repair purposes and for making new. This is an obvious example of an important sign, and we've even encountered and recommended in certain communities that important landmark signs like this one are actually landmark, just like a local like a building could be through a historic preservation ordinance. Sign could be as well. And then these character defining elements could also be more obscure or esoteric, like these maker's marks that exist on all of our or many built components on Main Street. So cast iron columns were made by Mesker Brothers or other manufacturers, and all of these little marks and signifiers again are not just pieces of graphic design, but they tell us where this material came from. So there's even a small, and these signs tend to be just inches in scale. So these small things link your buildings in your communities to these nationwide movements, and through recognition of these very small elements, you can tell such a large story about pre-manufacturing and development of downtown commercial centers at the turn of the 20th century through the use of pre-manufactured components, and how these were spread around the country, and the design similarities that as a result were able to occur on main streets. All of these kinds of stories actually I find personally more interesting than, John Shoe lived in this store from 1875 to so and so. Those stories are important, don't get me wrong, but they're important only locally. They don't have any value, significance to, not necessarily to visitors from out of town. And so having this additional layer in addition to the local components and being able to tie it to larger development history is important, and anybody can do this. All of the main streets have these markers everywhere that again tell us about the built environment. Before we talk about buildings individually, let's talk about the space that the buildings exist on. So public space elements are comprised of all of these various elements. I'm not even going to recite them all, but all of these comprise the built environment of the downtown, and the design committee and the Main Street organization at some point will deal with these issues, including parking. Whether through the work of the organization itself or through promoting that these things are handled and coordinating with the municipalities or other economic development agencies and organizations in the community. So in the larger basic training, we would go through each one of those and discuss their issues and merits, but we don't have time to do that today. What I will say that these elements, we can go back, they're all kind of utilitarian in nature, other than public art, but they do have all have an aesthetic component that if it works together, it can really reinforce the community branding and really make for an interesting experience. These two photographs are from Ishpeming, Michigan, which is a huge skiing destination. So they utilized, things that they needed to have anyway in town, like benches and wayfinding markers and street signs, but they tied the uh, to the identity of the community and reinforcing it through these streetscape elements. So this is an example of what can be done. And pardon? This one? The question is where this slide was taken, and I actually don't know. I inherited that one. I want to say it's probably not Des Moines, Iowa, but it's somewhere in Iowa. What's it? Clinton, Iowa? Okay, well, let's say that it is. Okay. Okay. Now I'm curious, so I'll have to I'll have to I'll have to verify it, but let's say that it's from Clinton, Iowa. So I think I should know where everything else is from. So I didn't realize this was going to be a quiz on where photographs were taken. I'll try to do my best. I know where this one was taken. That's in Central City, Colorado, where even though it's a casino town, there's a lot of, and probably because it's a casino town, there's a lot of money that is was able to be devoted on preserving at least the exterior appearances of facades. But in terms of the commercial building anatomy, Main Street buildings all possess a certain uniformity within then, which are then could be multiplied or accessorized, so to speak, to create to adapt into individual building styles or to individualize the storefronts, businesses, and the buildings. But the composition of a typical Main Street building can be likened to the composition of a classical column, this tripartite composition of base, shaft, and capital, which to the buildings it translates to the storefront as the base, the shaft as the upper facade, and the cornice forms the capital of the building. It's the transition between a building and the sky. There are also specific proportions that the Main Street buildings have that are common throughout the country, and those relate directly to available building technologies at the time. So typical Main Street width of a Main Street lot is about 25 feet, and that's tied to the effective span of a wood joist, which in the mid-19th century was about 22 feet. And when you add your 1.5 foot thick fire separation walls on either side, you end up with 25 feet. Now, in terms of the attenuated vertical proportion, that's also tied to, one, the lack of electricity, so the importance of daylighting. So taller ceilings and larger expanses of glass allowed daylighting to penetrate deeper into the spaces. But also the natural ventilation that was, that was the only thing you could do at the time, allowed for the warmer air to rise above the heads of the occupants. So it was this natural ventilation that was available. But these proportions of narrow width and tall height could be replicated on and on and on down the block to create, two-part commercial blocks, three-part, and then entire city blocks even. So, but that specific module is what we're working with. And this anatomy and proportions actually didn't change all that much throughout the various architectural styles. Again, they were sort of subject to fashionable treatments, so they were either simple or ornate, modern, austere. It just simply depended on the appropriate, whatever was in vogue in terms of architecture at the moment, but the basic components and the anatomy remains the same. We have a storefront, upper facade, and a cornice. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about signs because they generally form they're an opportunity for an involvement for the design committee and the Main Street organization. Yes, they change quite a bit as businesses go start up and go out of business, but they shouldn't be an afterthought. And signs are certainly an area, both from a policy standpoint and design standpoint, are a huge component of what a Main Street organization can be involved with. So in order to understand signs, we need to consider their function and then therefore placement. And it's the function and placement that are the two most important factors in terms of designing a sign, because they inform everything else. This particular example has a window graphic for both vehicular and pedestrian traffic, a projecting sign that's more for pedestrians, and then a seasonal sort of a sidewalk sign, again for pedestrians, that informs them of whether they're open or closed, or perhaps a coffee shop could have specials or something like that. So it has a number of different levels of signage to maximize its exposure and capture different sorts of traffic, vehicular or pedestrian. But as long as you consider what you want the sign to do and where you put it, the colors, the size, even choice of graphics and typefaces will all sort of fall into place. Well, you can allow them to fall into place if you have an open mind, rather than try to shove a certain identity and place an oversized sign in a particular location, or go in with something generic that doesn't respond to a building at all. In this case, we also have a Victorian era storefront, and so the Victorian choice of colors and graphics, even the sign armature, responds both to the storefront and as well to the nature of the business, which is an antique shop. So all of this works very well together. Here are just some examples to spur the imagination of quality projecting or hanging signs. They don't have to be boring. They can be even funny, like the Reality Bites sign, which is a programmatic type sign. So it's a great execution. And with the choices of materials that we now have, what seems like could be an expensive sign with gold leafing, for example, like on the Beehive Tavern and Grill, can be executed in other materials that are an imitation of more expensive materials. So it's still quality. It still does what it needs to at a lower cost. In places where you don't have room for larger signs, or signs that would obscure portions of a facade, banners can be utilized. So they're just projecting blades that serve as signs, and they can be fabric or metal. Flush-mounted signs are good for spots where you do have a blank expanse of a facade and you want to eat it up. So, but just because they're flush-mounted doesn't mean, again, that they don't have to have character, or they can't be three-dimensional. They can utilize all sorts of different components and be very creative. Individual letters are generally associated with kind of long-standing institutions and libraries and municipal functions, banks, because individual letters, especially in metal, tend to be more expensive. So that type of material implies a certain longevity and durability, and so it's associated with certain types of businesses. But other materials can be used as well for retail applications, and these type of solutions again provide an alternative They don't need a sign background per se. The building serves as a background, and there's nice interplay of shadows and those kinds of things. So I'm a big proponent of individual signs when they're appropriate. And window graphics are another example of the effects that can be achieved at a minimal cost. They're so great. They can be easily applied and removed without damaging the glass. They're inexpensive, and they can simulate the appearance of gold leaf if that's what's desired, as on the Cherry Grill Street example. And then they're just a great solution for windows. And again, there's really no excuse for not having at least good window graphics, because they're so inexpensive. Sidewalk signs, we all, I think, associate these with, handwritten boards and things that maybe have a DIY feel to it, but which is fine as long as they're quality, but they can really be of high quality, as these two examples. And also historic signs, we already mentioned that in the character and defining elements, that these like ghost signs, painted ghost signs, can be historic as well as neon. If they exist in a community, they should be evaluated, at least, not just discarded as advertisements of bygone businesses and products, but given a chance to perhaps contribute to the historic significance of the downtown. There's also an opportunity to, with minimal intervention, to repurpose these signs for new uses and new businesses. So I don't have a slide of it here, but the classic, let's say classic, it's become a classic the last couple of years example of this is the drugstore in Virginia, Illinois, who had a sign that spelled out drugs. And when a new coffee shop was moving in, and it was a historic sign and a historic storefront, she didn't have a name picked out yet, so she placed a dot between R and U, and the business became Dr. Ugg's Coffee Shop. And she, the entire intervention of this storefront and sign was a little vinyl dot. And we have someone in the audience that says they know the sign, so it's probably because we've shown the heck out of it the last couple of years. So, oh, you've seen it in person. Isn't it pretty cool? Obviously, we don't need a trend of Dr. Uggs popping up all over the place, because there's plenty of drugstores that need other identities, but it's just an example of what can occur. Illuminated signs. The best way, or the most kind of integrated way of illuminating a sign is through neon and LED as well, but LED is yet an unproven technology for these kinds of applications. So, but with due time, it will be a viable alternative to neon too. So these signs, they're all historic. They happen to be historic, but they can be executed in new signs. And in terms of those of you that are wondering in terms of sign ordinances and how to prohibit neon signs, sort of these rope signs in windows and those kinds of things, there's a way to define these signs as architectural neon versus just simply the use of neon. So these are, architectural neon signs and not just, neon tubing placed anywhere. So I think there is a way to distinguish between the two in ordinances and promote both installation of new and retention of historic, and then preventing just the sort of common use of neon that tends to have a negative connotation. Internally lit plastic signs are another way of illuminating a sign, and these are both inappropriate examples, and in fact most internally lit plastic signs tend to be inappropriate. But that's more having to do with I think the design and the execution rather than the material itself, because there are examples of the material being utilized in a very good way, and believe it or not, I don't have the examples here, but no, I had to cut out a lot of this to fit, but you'll just have to see the full basic training at some point. Again, um, but these examples are obviously borderline horrendous. So I think one's close by to Maria's, I think was from Belvedere originally, so it may still be there. It looks like some kind of tarantula sitting on a building. So yes, we should just have a Budweiser sign hanging from it, and we'd be set. Another way of illuminating a sign, which is the classic example that's usually acknowledged as appropriate, is through external lighting, through gooseneck fixtures, but they don't have to be traditional gooseneck fixtures. They can be more modern, but that's a good way to illuminate a sign. Again, if there is, as long as it fits in within the design intent and scope of the overall sign and rehab project. Another component that we have a lot of opportunity to be involved in the discussion of what's good, what's bad, and shaping the policies, because we tend to develop incentive programs that fund awnings and signs. Our awnings, so they are a big design element of Main Street, and they, in terms of fabric awnings, they can be fixed or retractable, so they can be rolled down in winter, in the summer, sorry, to shade the windows, and rolled up in the winter to allow for heat gain. So retractable awnings are really great, and where they exist, they should be retained and repaired if possible, because newer retractable awnings are much more expensive than fixed ones. So canopies may be appropriate on Main Street, and in Illinois we have less of a history of wooden canopies like this one, but in other states they exist commonplace in place of fabric awnings. But the point being is that they're appropriate. They can be appropriate on Main Streets. Metal canopies can also be appropriate. In fact, the metal canopies like the one on the left, manufactured by Mesker Brothers from the 1890s, are even more appropriate than fabric awnings. So where they remain, they should be retained. And then modern canopies from the 1930s to the 50s on also can be appropriate, and again should be evaluated with the overall storefront and be given their proper significance potential if appropriate. And also both of these are viable methods of providing new awnings, although their manufacturing potential is somewhat limited. They were commonplace at the time. They're less commonplace and therefore available now. Just like with signs, awnings and canopies, the most important thing to consider is the placement and the number of canopies. One could have easily splashed an entire awning over this little storefront, but that would have obstructed some architectural detailing and disrupted the connection between the storefront and the upper facade. So it's very important that awnings exist over openings and within their openings, and not are spanned over blank facades and architectural detailing. So they should be within the openings that they're trying to shade. And here are just a few examples of non-traditional awning and canopy installations, mixtures of different materials that are very, very creative and all appropriate on Main Street. Any questions at this point? No? Okay. Oh, yeah. Yeah, with the rope chain. Yeah, very nice effect. Okay. Well, just we need to look at inappropriate things too. So that oftentimes helps us to determine what is appropriate. So this one is a slightly oversized awning, but its shape is inappropriate. So it's this quarter round shape, bubble type awning is inappropriate on Main Street. It's the traditional shed triangular shape that's historically appropriate. This is more of a boutique appearance that doesn't have historic precedent on Main Street um, and simply is not appropriate. This one, if you could call it an awning or a canopy, it's just something stuck to a building that obscures most of it. Is obviously overscaled and of inappropriate materials. It's metal siding. So, and then this one, we already talked about the shape, which is also inappropriate here, but the fact that it's internally illuminated, I know it's trying to double up as a sign, but this is a big no-no for on Main Street and on historic commercial buildings. It really shouldn't be utilized. It's so garish that there should be ordinances written to prevent this from happening. So, moving on to basic building maintenance, there is a great quote by Richard Nicol that great architecture has only two natural enemies, water and stupid men. There's not much we could do about stupid men, but we can kind of guard against water. And by the way, with Main Street, you're going to deal with both, with water and stupid men. So it's one of the reasons why Main Street is such a unique approach. The water, guarding against water, so the basic building maintenance is about water, or our discussion. The stupid men discussion is another one, how to deal with owners who don't want to do anything, or developers who want to tear down property, but we're not going to cover it today. Water damage begins, well, at the top of the building. So if you don't have a roof that's functional, or if you have a damaged roof and if you don't take care of it, it can eventually lead to this. So this is a fallen roof on a Art Deco theater in Metropolis, Illinois. Water can find its way through numerous points on a roof, and so it's not just through the roof surface itself, but the parapet should be properly covered with some kind of coping so the water doesn't penetrate the space between the withes of brick and then enter the building that way. Flashing is also very important. So on the left is a less appropriate example. On the right is an appropriate one with metal that's mortared into the mortar joints of the brick and with counter flashing to allow the proper shedding of water without the water entering the building. Just slapping asphalt, tar, whatever it may, onto joints is not a good long-term solution. So it needs to be done properly. It's something that's invisible to us on the street, but these are some of the most critical repair and design decisions that have to be made about buildings. So what happens when the water enters the middle of the wall? It travels down the wall, and then it collects on horizontal surfaces that interrupt its flow. In this case, we're looking at a corner of a window and a horizontal structural member, a steel lintel in this case, has collected water. And when steel collects water, it rusts, and when steel rusts, it expands, and that's called rust jacking. And this rusted steel has pushed out onto adjoining surfaces, in this case brick, and caused cracking. So, and this condition would only continue to worsen, and it can lead to some serious damage. So, water penetration is key. As the water makes its way down the buildings, even gutters and downspouts are incredibly important. Paint pails are not substitute for a downspouts. I'm sorry, and you could see the amount of water that has been there historically because a tree grew under it, and it's actually that tree that supports that paint pail now between the downspout. So obviously, um, something that needs to be taken care of. And the frustrating part in encountering these kinds of things, that these are such cheap fixes. Downspouts, gutters, especially the extensions, are, a few bucks, and all it needs is reconnecting, and you're good to go. Or you can repair now thousands of dollars worth of masonry damage because your downspout wasn't connected, as in the example on the right. As the water, even if you have this downspout connected, if it empties out at the base of the building, where is it going to go? The shaping of the slope is important. If the water, it's like pouring water at the base of your building, so it's going to enter the ground. It can be wicked up by the brick, or it can enter into the basement. So just because it made its way off the roof and your roof is okay, doesn't mean that you're done. You have to get it away from your building, because if it sits at the base of the building, again, it can be wicked up, and then water tries to escape. And here, this photo demonstrates so many different things, so many wrong things that were done to this poor wall, all linked to water. As water tries to escape the wall, it tries to escape the wall through the easiest means of exit, which tends to be the mortar, because the mortar needs to be softer than the brick. The mortar is the sacrificial layer or component of a brick of masonry construction wall. If the mortar is too hard, then water tries to escape through the brick. Or if the brick is painted or covered with another material, again, the water will spall the surfaces of the brick, and you're losing the structural component of the brick, in addition to the water, and it's just not a good scenario. So these common sense practices and repair methodologies for masonry should be utilized in order to prevent serious damage down the line. Improper repointing. This is hopefully an obvious example of which is proper and which isn't. In addition to visually marring the surface of this building, the mortar is probably too hard, and again, it's going to cause actual problems, not just visual problems for this building. So the mortar has to be the right composition, size, depth, texture. All of those things make a difference. Here's an example of proper repointing. These very thin joints, it would have been very easy by a mason or a contractor to overgrind and widen the joints, but this was the old mortar was carefully removed and is being filled with a colored tinted mortar in this case. So then both visually and functionally, the mortar in this case will be a proper repair solution. In terms of cleaning, sometimes all it takes is a cleaning, but we should begin with gentlest means possible. Instead, what we often hear still to this day is, I'm going to sandblast my building. And anything followed with blasting is usually not a good idea. Even walnut shell blasting can damage the surface. It's the nozzle control, the material that you're blasting with, the distance away from the material that you're blasting. All of those things have play a role. So it's not that sandblasting can't be utilized for certain things in controlled environments. For example, paint removal from cast iron, or to abrade metal surfaces that need to be repainted. Sandblasting with, again, controlled pressure and distance can be effective. But generally when people say, I'm going to blast something with this, they don't mean gently. So that's why they say blast. Start with warm water, soap, and a nylon bristle brush, and then move up from there to maybe some solvents or chemicals and those kinds of things that won't hurt the building. And, if necessary, maybe blasting is the last solution if it can be controlled, but not the first. Windows are obviously a huge topic in historic preservation, and a continuing battle between preservationists and window manufacturers and municipalities and and also homeowners and building owners who are deceived by claims of window manufacturers whose job is to sell new windows. So why would they tell you that you can repair your window? If they do that, that means you're not buying their new window from them. So let's look into motivations of what people are doing before we accept their facts for what they are. So in any case, before window replacement should be the last resort, and we're not going to talk about how windows can be replaced, because we're hoping that they're not, that they can be repaired with simple weatherization improvements, weather stripping, again, very inexpensive products that can improve your energy efficiency, thermal efficiency, even operational functionality of the window, and at a fraction of the cost. Storm windows tend to be a really good investment because they provide this optimal layer of this air pocket for energy thermal efficiency, and they also preserve the historic fabric if they're placed on the outside. So they tend to be a good investment, and they pay for themselves over the life of the window, rather than new windows, which don't pay for themselves in terms of energy savings. So and plus, a good storm is a good investment whether you're going to restore your window down the line or replace it anyway. It offers you that additional layer of protection and thermal efficiency. So why not invest in a storm window, protect your historic window before you can get to repairing it, and then even if you ended up with a new window down the line, that storm window is still useful. But people tend to equate window replacement with thermal efficiency improvements, whereas replacing windows for that reason, again, does not pay for itself. Where you can vastly improve the efficiency of your building through mechanical systems. Nobody ever talks about that, but that's where it's a wise investment to improve the comfort of the occupants and usability of the building and thermal efficiency. So that's where we should be spending our money rather than replacing our historic windows, which will outlast any new windows that we will put in today. Any questions at this point? I think we're doing good on time. We have half an hour left, but I don't think it'll take us that long. Paint is a wonderful thing when it's appropriate. This is an example where it's not. So because not everything needs to be painted or should be painted. So unpainted brick should be left unpainted. It's a totally unnecessary and inappropriate intervention for a masonry wall. So the rule of thumb is materials that were historically painted or previously painted can be repainted and perhaps probably should be repainted, and materials that were not painted before should not be. If we follow that guideline, we're going to deal with most of the questions whether to paint or not paint. Now, where paint is necessary, it's great because it doubles up as a maintenance material, but also as an aesthetic intervention. So you're dealing with multiple things at once. You know, you're obviously prolonging the life of these materials because they needed to be painted, but now how much better it looks too. Now, paint is also inexpensive, relatively speaking, but can be so dramatic. So, and you know, even the awnings and lights aside for this storefront, let's focus just on the paint and what a dramatic improvement that alone does. And again, it's part of the maintenance cycle of this particular material. Pardon? In this example? Well, windows were, actually those are the historic windows. They were uncovered. They were covered up, so they were uncovered. And the storefront, unfortunately, was not reopened. The openings were retained, but that's okay. I think, you know, a partial win is still a win. So I think in dealing with choices of paint for Main Street buildings, the key is taste and restraint. It's easy to get carried away, and this building is one of few that successfully manages a multiple color scheme. You know, the colors are well chosen together. It's appropriate to the architecture period of this building, and notice that only the things that are meant to be painted are painted. So even though it's a busy color scheme, again, it works well here because of some restraint and strategic placement of the colors. Ultimately, however, this is a mantra that we employ and promote. Don't paint, it's just paint. And that's because color is a design issue, not a preservation one. Remember, as long as we follow the rule of, you know, if it's not painted, don't paint it. And if it's painted, it's okay to paint it. As long as that's a preservation consideration. As long as we are only painting what should be painted, the color is a design intervention. And the thing with paint is that you'll have to repaint it at some point. So these aren't permanent changes. All it takes to remedy this purple building is, well, to paint it again. So it's not ideal, but I think there's probably another bigger design issue to deal with in this particular town other than this purple building. So, which is, you know, a clever choice actually for this building and for this business because it's eye-catching and I'm sure, you know, they're known as the purple building in town. So as a result, everybody knows what they are. It's a great advertising strategy, but not that we're promoting it here. But ultimately, all of these changes and interventions and repair methodologies to our buildings should be guided by the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation. These standards are nationally adopted concepts about maintaining, repairing, and replacing historic buildings and designing additions or making alterations. The standards are also involved not just in the brick and mortar projects, but in terms of developing policies. So your design guidelines or your ordinances hopefully should be based on the standards and take historic preservation into consideration. These are what the State Historic Preservation Office uses to review tax credit projects and tax act projects, state regulatory projects. So it's already utilized at the federal and state level, and again, these are kind of common sense rules, the 10 commandments of preservation that one should follow. The question is in terms of writing grants and whether you should follow the standards. Well, I think if you're going to try to solicit grants or obtain grants, they're most likely going to specify that you follow the standards. But your question may be, if you're giving grants to building owners or merchants, yes, I think that the standards, you should get something that's of quality for your investment. If you, Main Street, as a preservation-based organization, are going to fund improvements on Main Street, those improvements should be preservation-based. So yes, they should be tied to some sort of minimal review or some kind of standards for the work. And this is the last section of our presentation with some time to spare, so we're doing very good on time. Financial incentives. There are a number of options, not as many as there should be or you'd hoped for, but there generally are federal and state grants, tax incentives, and local incentives options. So we'll go quickly through these different levels. In terms of federal and state grants, there are actually not that many available for brick and mortar projects. So they tend to fund planning projects. So planning studies, they could be National Register nominations, design guidelines, those kinds of things. And then when they are available, they're typically for publicly owned or publicly accessible buildings or a very specific building type or occupancy. So let's say for libraries or something like that. But the planning grants can be available through a number of sources, such as the National Midwest Office of the National Trust for Historic Preservation or the Certified Local Government Program through the State Historic Preservation Office. The tax incentives are the most easily achievable form of incentives because there is not a cap on those and the rules are well established, so and formulas are all known. So basically, as long as you follow certain steps, you will get that tax incentive. Whereas grants and other forms of funding are very competitive, they vary from year to year, you simply cannot count on them. It's not that you shouldn't pursue them, but the tax incentives are just statutorily always there. They're still subject to funding, but they're not necessarily in danger of being defunded. Although the 10% tax credit is not utilized very well in it, and there's been talk of maybe getting rid of it. So, and that one is probably the easiest of all to take. But in any way, there are historic tax credits and non-historic tax credits. We'll touch on each a bit. And so they function like a rebate. You have to expend the cost first, so it doesn't fund your project directly. That's the downside. But then the percentage of your project cost is subtracted from the income taxes that you owe. In terms of the historic rehabilitation tax credit, it's the 20% federal credit. So, and you have to meet 4 criteria to qualify for it. It has to be a commercial property, income producing. It has to be a historic building, so on the National Register of Historic Places, either individually listed or a contributing building in a historic district. You have to expend a certain amount of money. It has to be a substantial rehab, which is basically the value of the building itself. And then the work has to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards, which we touched on. So, and that work is reviewed both at the state and federal level. But this credit has been tremendously successful throughout the country, and there's some great projects that happened because of this credit. So we hope that people utilize it, that it stays. And we hope that Illinois could develop a state tax credit to layer on top of it, which would provide a greater incentive. A lot of states like Missouri have that. So, in fact, I think all the states surrounding us have state tax credits. We don't. Surprise? No. Non-historic tax credits, there are two that are commonly available, both federal. One is 10%, very easy to take because it's for non-historic buildings. So, and the building still has to be income producing, but that's great since we're talking about Main Street. Non-residential, so whereas for the 20% tax credit, rental residential would count. For this, it will not. It's for buildings built before 1936. Now, why so specific? Well, it's because rather than writing it so it's for buildings 50 years or older, the way it was written in 1986 was that, it's for buildings in 1936, which were 50-year-old buildings at the time. And statutorily, that's never been changed. So we're stuck with it, and that needs to be changed to allow, 30 years of additional building activity to take advantage of this. But there is no standards review here. So essentially, it's a form that you append to your taxes. It's very easy to take. You should still consult your accountant, but anything that you do on your building with some limits, but is count or is eligible. And yes, it's only half as lucrative as the 20%, but you don't have to do all of these other things, and the building doesn't have to be officially historic. So buildings that are non-contributing in a National Register district would also qualify for this. The other credit, which this credit, the 50% tax credit, you can take in conjunction with the 20%. The 10% you cannot. It's one or the other because your building's eligible for one or the other, not both. The 50% tax credit is for accessibility improvements such as ramps or widening hallways or making your bathrooms handicapped accessible, those kinds of things. And it funds 50% of the amount of rehab up to $5,000. So if you spend $10,000 in a given year, you can get $5,000 back, and you can take it every year. So there is no cap, or the cap is for the annual expenditure. If you spend $15,000, you still only get $5,000 back. So that's the cap on the on the credit. But you could strategically combine the 50% with the 20%. For example, anything that's handicapped accessible improvement, take the 50% on because you get more back, and then take the 20 on the rest. You can also combine larger expenditures, accessibility expenditures, such as an elevator, for example, where you can, if you make those improvements at the end of a calendar year, you could get for example, the pay for the shaft in December and then get the cab in January, and then you get $5,000 in each year, rather than being limited to only half that amount. So 50% is a good credit. Local incentive options, this is a not all-inclusive list, but these are the more common examples. So the facade improvement grant, those range in monetary value that are typically established by Main Street organizations. There are zero or low interest loans that you guys can work with, local lending institutions to establish. Tax increment financing, or TIF, is another mechanism to pay for improvements downtown, including facade restorations. And then tax abatement, could be another mechanism that's an incentive to spur development within the downtown district. Other forms of that or variations are enterprise zones and those kinds of things, or if you purchase materials from within a certain geographic area, you also get a tax abatement. So there are a number of different things that can be done, and it's just working creatively with the municipality and other institutions who have to, like banks, have to make a certain number of funding available for certain type projects anyway, by regulation. So they're often willing to work with organizations on how to develop these kinds of programs. And the last thing about design, this is just sort of in terms of inspiration, is that don't take anything for granted, no matter how small a particular or insignificant a particular historic character or element could be. Everything makes a difference, and this deteriorated billboard could go from this to this, from being a detriment to an asset, and all of these small improvements make a difference. You already know that Main Street is about incremental change, and those kinds of things. This kind of project could easily be undertaken by the design committee. It's small, and it makes a tremendous impact. So, and those kinds of projects an organization and community can build off of, and to spur larger, more meaningful development. But all of these things do matter. So that's all for design, but we can have a Q&A question session as a wrap-up if you wish. Any questions?
All these formats, like the tax incentives and the credits and grants, does Main Street offer a packet that says, so you're not out there searching for these documents, for these forms? Is there one stop, here's the guidelines for this incentive and here's the form?
So that, very good.
Packets that are available.
Very good question. The question is whether the Main Street, and I'm going to ask you to clarify it, Main Street locally or statewide Main Street? Okay. Whether the statewide Main Street program provides some kind of packet of financial information and the requirements that the building owner will have to follow. We don't know of all the local options that are available. So I think a packet of information should be put together at a local level that incorporates the state and federal incentives, which we do provide to local Main Street programs, but those have to be supplemented with locally available options. So, and it's because it's, part of the local Main Street organization's role in developing these local incentives. I think that's a project for, design committee / economic restructuring committee, maybe in conjunction, to develop incentives and put together packets of information to distribute to property owners. We as a state Main Street program can provide that information to the local programs, but after that it's up to the locals.
So you can hand somebody and say, well, here's a guideline, here's a list of what you need to do
Sure.
for this project,
Yeah.
Grant or whatever it might be, and here's a form to fill out that you're going to be required. It's kind of all there instead of kind of going out on the internet or
Sure.
somewhere and trying to find it. It's a daunting task. As attractive as a 50%, accessibility thing is. Okay, I can do that, but how do I document? What's the format that we need to
Sure,
follow? So
sure.
if we can hand somebody, so you want to do that, here, it's all in the packet, just kind of follow the recipe, and it makes it much easier than saying, no, I don't have time for that as much as I want to do that. It can be very.
No, I think streamlining that for the property owners is a great idea, but it is the role of a local organization. Resources are out there, and absolutely, and again, we can provide information about, and we do provide information about the tax credits, the things that are the mainstays that are always available, and then we have to periodically inform the Main Street programs about grants, which tend to be cyclical, and again, they're not necessarily funded year to year, so that always changes.
Competitive.
And competitive too, very competitive, highly. But that's not to say that that's why a skilled grant writer is a good person to know and have involved. So you got to know how to write grants. So, but no, it's a great idea, and we would encourage any Main Street program to first evaluate all incentives that are available, then figure out whether they need to develop any, and then put together a packet, distribute it to every owner. But not only that, offer advice and expertise on how to maneuver through these various processes. Even if you have the form, you may still need assistance on how to fill it out. And yeah, yeah. So, but yeah, it's something that Main Street groups should be doing.
And encourage the city to go out and add to the packet. The local level, what can you do?
Was an example, as an example.
I mean, even the city doesn't know how to administer the TIF as of yet. We have a TIF, but it's still this black box that nobody knows how to open.
Well, and as an example of, we talked about the upstairs downtown program and upper story development for your building. So say you have the 10% tax credit that you can take. You could take the 50% tax credit. You have your project outlined, and you have these financing options to pay for some of it. But you still require a direct investment. So then, if you know what you have available and what other local options are available, then you can work with the city to what is an incentive that can be developed in order to make this happen. And the reason why is because obviously the more it's for the betterment of the downtown, the more people live downtown, the better it is going to be for their budgetary.
Somebody would be willing to
Sure.
kind of go through those processes ahead of doing the project, when in most cases, I think small single building owners just want to build it out and get it going, and that tends to slow down the process. And I think it tends to be kind of, how do you get around saying, no, we can streamline this. It's worth doing, and maybe then you could do more.
Well, the comment is that if it's a big enough project, then it's worth going through these steps. But smaller building owners tend to make the improvements, and then you just want to get it done. But a series of smaller or a series of owners wanting to make smaller improvements can also constitute a larger project that can spur the city to do something. I think you're right, they're less likely to kind of deal with individual people who want to do small things to their buildings, but if they can develop an incentive that is applicable to an open-ended incentive, or that applies to a number of different projects and a number of different people, I think that's the way to approach a municipality about something like that. And again, the Main Street organization can serve as a vehicle for that, because it's already working with merchants and property owners. It presumably has a good rapport with the building owner community. So something to consider. No easy answers here. So, any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much for your time, and we'll officially end the recording, and this will be available on the website pretty soon. Thank you.